Yep. So let me move on to the next section, education. It's a national industry. Um, did I miss that? Okay. Yeah. In Singapore, education is owned by the state. There are hardly any private operators, or at least none for local born children. We do have many international schools that are privately run, like the Singapore American School, the Singapore Canadian School, the Singapore Japanese School, but these largely cater to their own communities. Americans who are stationed in Singapore who send their kids and want the American style education. Japanese corporations who have their personnel based here, they will send their kids to the Singapore Japanese School. We have a Singapore French school as well. So differing communities that have come from overseas, they've actually set up their own international schools, and all those are privately run. But for the average Singaporean, if you are born and bred in Singapore, you will go through the national system, and it's all entirely owned by the state. There is no option to not be part of the national school system, except on two grounds. Maybe what I can do is just mention it briefly when I go through this comparison that you see on your screen. On the right is the American system. On the left is the American system. On the right is the Singapore system. I've tried to put them side by side so that you can have kind of a comparison. You would see there in the big cloud bubbles. In the US system, you'll probably have your first standardized assessment of everybody in the system at age 16, which is your SAT scores, that then therefore determine your entrance to, sorry, not 16, at 18, where you then determine your entrance to college. So in the American system, pretty much everybody in any state does their own thing, but they sit for one standardized assessment at the SAT. Whereas in Singapore, we start a lot earlier. At age 12, our kids actually go through a national exam. So at age 12, all 12-year-olds would sit for what we call the primary school leaving examination, where children, therefore, based on their scores, are then sorted into different kinds of post-primary education system, educational institutions. The vast majority of these children will actually make it into our secondary schools that run both 4-year and 5-year programs. Now, the 4-year programs are called the express stream, and then the 5-year programs are called the normal stream. So, which more or less gives you an idea that, the normal stream is actually the amount of time that you were supposed to have taken to complete that course, but everybody's going through the express one, the 4 years. And at the end of that 4 years, they will take the Cambridge General Certificate of Education, the O levels, as we call it, the ordinary levels. And then after that, based on those results, those who wish to go to junior college, which is a college prep program for 2 years, they would take the A levels at the end of that. Now, for some children who don't do well enough to get into a college, but they still want to do a prep program, there's a 3-year option, but the whole of Singapore, there's only one institution left that offers it, right? And all these are all state-run, and these are all officially under the Ministry of Education in Singapore. Now, for children who don't want to do that pre-college prep program, there is the German-style polytechnic system, which is modeled after the German polytechnics, which are more of a vocational trade school kind of setup that prepares young people for industry. They offer 3-year diplomas. You spend 3 years studying something like nursing or electronics that will give you a diploma that will prepare you for the working world. So this setup was actually built to serve the economy, which I mentioned earlier. So for those who were deemed more academically able, they were channeled towards the pre-university route, then that will prepare them to get college degrees. Whereas those who were so-called deemed not as academically able would go into polytechnics and get a diploma so they can go out and work. That perception has changed over the years. Today, we have a lot of very bright students who make it into the polytechnics. And many of them after the polytechnic education, they will actually go on to college, university. And then on the extreme right, you will see schools that are called true train schools. These are actually reserved for the academic elite of Singapore because they do very well at the PSLE. They actually go into schools that offer them a true train. They skip the O levels. They take the A levels at the end of it. And then these are usually the top 2 to 5% of each cohort. And so they are deemed the exceedingly bright ones. They have done very well at the primary school leaving examinations. So therefore, they get a true train pass all the way to the A levels. And then you also have that bright green box there, the international schools. There are 3 international schools that are open to Singaporean students. These are all run privately, and they are the only ones that are approved if you don't want to be in the national state system and you want to do international school, if you're Singaporean. So these are the only 3 that are allowed. And then, of course, you can see that bright pink box there for all Singaporean males. Singapore is still a country that practices conscription. So all males would still have to serve national service, which is a 2-year mandatory military service for all males. That happens at the end of either their college or at the end of their polytechnic education. This part is usually a part that a lot of educators are very interested in asking questions about. So if any of you are interested in asking, feel free to throw up a question now. If not, y'all can just study this in detail, and at any point, if you want to ask questions, please feel free to ask. Right?
Jeremy, maybe you could explain the A levels and O levels, because that's, unless we're familiar with the British system, unless you did, I had to step out for a minute, so maybe you did, but this could be a really important. If you understand A and O levels, then you understand how a lot of the education around the world works.
Yeah. So the O levels is basically considered the end of compulsory education. So all children are expected to at least do 10 years of secondary education, and the O level is sort of like the graduating cert. So in Singapore, if you apply for a job, usually the point of reference is the O levels. So and then after the O levels, the results of the O levels will determine whether you're able to get into a college prep program, the junior college, or whether you qualify for a polytechnic program. The cutoff points for a polytechnic program are lower than that requirement for a junior college. So the O-level results are used to further stream children, sort children into suitable courses of study after that. Yeah. So traditionally, the more academically able kids would actually go to the junior colleges based on their O-level results. But today, that's no longer the case. You have very bright kids who will go into the polytechnics. Yeah. So it's a kind of a means which the system uses to further sort children for suitable courses of study at age 16. Yeah. Then the A levels is basically that which is used to determine whether you qualify for varsity courses. So it's sort of like the SAT, but it's only one measure now because most of the children actually don't go into the junior colleges. So the A levels actually for example, you would probably have to ace the A levels to get into law, to get into medicine, or any of the top professional degrees in the universities. So that's the purpose of the O levels and the A levels. Yeah. And then you can see that the A levels is also used for the true train schools and the international schools. They will either offer the A levels as the graduating certification, or they'll offer the international baccalaureate, which will allow them therefore to take that qualification and go overseas as well to do college education. Any other questions by anyone? If not, I'll move on. So education is universal. We have a compulsory education act. So far, I don't think we have jailed anyone who didn't send their kids to school, but the provision is there. So any child from age 6 to 15 is covered by this act. Parents must send their children to school. The exception is that you can homeschool your kids, but you need to have proof that you have a comprehensive homeschool program that you are adhering to and that your child is still being educated. The numbers of kids who are homeschooled is very small. Most kids, almost 90% of kids, all go to a national school. The exception being uh, Islamic religious schools. There is a very small proportion of Muslims children who actually go to the Islamic schools, but even they have to adhere to national standards. They are regulated, and they would have still have to sit for the primary school leaving examination to make sure that these children don't lose out and they are able to be on par with kids from the national system. Singapore system actually is a hybrid system. The vast majority of schools are actually state-run, but we still have schools that have passed as a missionary school set up by churches, Methodist Church, the Presbyterians, the Catholic Church. They have schools that are part of the national school system. What happens is that the state funds up to 90% of their construction, pays for the staffing, appoints the principals for these schools in consultation with these organizations, and then the schools offer a national curriculum. But in essence, the schools are still owned by the clan associations or the churches that started these schools. We also have special education schools that cater for children who have physical or intellectual disabilities. And these are run in partnership with voluntary welfare organizations and with another ministry. And overall, the Ministry of Education in Singapore oversees and funds kindergarten to college level education and oversees higher education. So all the universities and the polytechnics, they are independent, they decide what they want to teach, but the Ministry of Education has oversight. It advises them on what's appropriate, what's not. But the funding is, the Ministry of Education funds all the state-run kindergartens, all primary schools, all secondary schools, and all junior colleges are funded by the Ministry of Education. And all their teachers are employees of the Ministry of Education. Technically, all of them are civil servants. So these are some statistics, if you're interested. In total, how many schools we have currently as of 2021, we have 341 schools in the national system. You can see the number is actually falling because Singapore's demographic is that we are aging society. Singapore's fertility rate is one of the lowest in the world. I think we're at 1.2 now. We are far below replacement rate. So Singapore is ever looking for immigrants. We've been closing schools in aging estates and opening up new ones in new estates to cater for the demographic shift. So you can see that our number of primary schools have fallen in a way, not significantly. Number of secondary schools have more or less remained constant over the last 5 years. We've got the mixed level schools are almost exclusively all owned by churches. So there is no change there. The state cannot close these schools without agreement from the organizations that own these schools, right? Pre-university, we've got only 11 now. We have basically that includes the junior colleges. We have closed down several junior colleges to sort of like reduce the number of junior college students. And then we have only one centralized institute, which is for that 3-year pre-college program. So it's the only institute in Singapore that offers that. Number of students we have in our system, slightly above 500,000 children. So they list there all the different kinds of educational institutions. We have the Institute of Technical Education. These provide children with technical skills that prepare them for the economy. These will cover things like hospitality, office administration, even graphic design, cybersecurity, culinary. We have 2 art institutions, the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, that cater to those with artistic bent, so like visual arts, performing arts. Then we have got 5 polytechnics that, as I mentioned earlier on, is modeled after the German system that provide them with trade skills to allow them to function in the economy. So achievements of Singapore education system, I think is pretty well known. Singapore has been top in pizza, top in TIMSS, one of the best educational systems in the world, ranked up there with the Finnish system. Some people claim that Singapore now is #1. though we are very modest and very humble, we don't think that we um, have quite deserved that accolade. But the reality is that many people are visiting Singapore to see how our education system functions. So Singapore's phases, the phases that we have gone through to be what we are. Um, so Singapore, from the time that it became dependent, very vulnerable, needed to depend on the cultivation of human capital. So that's why huge investments in the education system, right? We had to make sense of the colonial heritage of British. The British didn't really give much attention to education. They set up one or two schools for the Malay elite, for the local elite. The rest was pretty much left to the locals to take care of themselves. So there were a lot of vernacular schools provided by the community. There wasn't a state or national system to speak of. So when Singapore became independent, that was a priority. Rapidly expand the state system, train teachers, hire teachers, um, and to serve these purposes, to build a cohesive country, help Singapore transit from a trade economy to an open export based economy, strengthen the social fabric. So the national curriculum is a must so that it gives a common social experience for all Singaporean children. They all go through the same thing. Everybody remembers the whole process of going to school. So the experience is the same. That becomes a common talking point and identity marker for Singaporeans, right? Um, so language, skills. So basically Singapore is an English medium education system with a bilingual component. Every child has to learn a second language, which is called their mother tongue language, which is tied to their ethnicity declared at birth. Right, so 4 phases of Singapore education system initially was a survival-driven education, huge emphasis on numeracy, literacy, um, uh, and to basically get kids into technical schools where they could learn the skills necessary for jobs in the economy, with a cultivation of a very small proportion to go on to varsity education, because there weren't that many jobs for that tier of people. Today, varsity education expanded tremendously because Singapore has transited into a first world country, right? So then that moves into the 1970s, where you have an industrial, the move to build skills for industrial-based economy. So we call that phase the efficiency-driven education. I'll expand a bit more on this on the following slides. Then by the time we reached the 1990s, early 2000, was preparing Singapore for a knowledge-based economy, because a lot of the manufacturing in Singapore had actually moved out of Singapore. It didn't exist anymore in Singapore. These jobs were gone. I was preparing Singaporeans for the emerging digital age at that time. And then today in Singapore, we're talking about a values-driven education, because Singapore now is so much different society than what it used to be. Very open, a lot of immigrants. So this whole idea of using values to anchor the nation is more of is the currency nowadays when we talk about Singapore education. So this is a snapshot of what survival-driven education was like in the 1960s to the 1970s. Bilingual education system, as I mentioned, merging all the diverse education systems into a national one, right? A lot of investment in technical education, numeracy, literacy, building social cohesion, citizenship education. You must understand that during this period, there was not a very strong sense of what it was to be a Singaporean. We suddenly became a country overnight. In some quarters, people grew up under a different flag. They didn't identify the new nation. So there was that need to strengthen these things. So there was a lot of nation building, a bit of nationalistic elements into it, and huge expansion of teacher education. So the Institute of Education was actually set up in 1973. So this is the second phase, efficiency-driven education. Industrialized country, still the emphasis on numeracy and literacy, and then emphasizes on the sciences. And even till today, we have a strong emphasis on the sciences, because we have a lot of industries that are requiring people with very strong science backgrounds, pharmaceuticals, biomedical sciences. These are very heavily emphasized. Yeah. So this idea of reducing educational wastage so that kids don't drop out of school after 10 years, they move on to post-secondary education so they can get better paying jobs because of the higher technical skills required for those jobs. And then there's the start of this thing where we start to differentiate different streams of different kids so that you don't have a one size fit all. In the past, if you failed the PSLE, you will have to repeat for 2 years. So you have kids who are like 14 years old still taking the same exam as 12-year-old kids. Ability-driven education, this was up till the early 2011 or so. Teachers were urged then now to move into less of a rote learning, more facilitation. There was a relook of the entire education system to harmonize all the subjects, etc., so that things would make more sense. There was a creation of independent schools. That diversity you saw earlier on was a product of this period of time where they created more different schools to cater to kids of different abilities, which didn't exist previously. So even today, we have a dedicated School of the Arts, which is a product of that period, where now we have a school that caters to kids with special talents in music, art, drama, and so that there's a nationally funded outlet for these kids to develop their talents further. And of course, a lot of professional development for teachers, building up that structure to improve the quality of our teachers. And that brings us to the present, this idea of now, as we have emerged as a nation, matured as a nation, we also need to mature our education system, whereby now this whole idea of making sure that every school is a good school, that the quality of education offered to every child is consistent across all of our national schools. They have opened up varsity education. Now we have 5 universities, whereas previously there was only 1 at Independence. We are opening up multiple pathways, different areas for different kids to explore their talents and abilities. And also there's a movement now to redefine success beyond just academic grades. So challenges ahead for Singapore. As an educator, I would say that these are some of the key aspects. There has, over the past decade or so, there's been a lot of ground voice and rumblings about how much stress the education system places on our children. So there has been a deliberate shift away. Singapore is actually moving away from assessments. We are actually removing heavy assessment at different levels. We have actually removed all mid-year assessments, which is a huge shift. We have actually removed assessments for all our primary 1 and primary 2 children. It doesn't happen anymore. And all this is in the name of removing away the psychological stress of performing well in our high-stress educational system. There's also a lot of differentiation now, down to the point where teachers now are increasingly trained to do differentiated teaching in the classrooms to cater for kids of different abilities. This whole idea of opening up multiple pathways, we're continuing to explore whether the existing educational institutions that we have cater to the range of abilities. Are we able to open up new courses and routes for children to explore their talents? We now even have specialized schools for a specialized school for autistic children, which didn't exist previously. We have specialized schools for kids who are academically unable to clear the primary school education exam. We have schools that are catered for kids who are on the lower academic spectrum, where we give them still a standard national school experience, but with a more of a vocational twist, so as to better position them for adulthood. This whole exam focus has moved away. We don't actually talk about all schools have been told you aren't allowed to set exams in the middle of the year anymore. So really it's like everybody has to toe the line. No one can, we don't talk about rewarding kids with academic success anymore. In the past, if you did very well in the national exam, your name will be up there. There will be a roll of honor. that you even appear on television commercials because companies will actually pay these kids to advertise their products. All of that is gone. It's totally outlawed. It's banned. Schools have removed their roles of honor. Top students are no longer named. No one actually knows who is the top student anymore. So there's a lot of movement in the opposite direction with a huge de-emphasis of academic success in terms of exam achievement. So these are some of the huge changes that are happening. And these are also the challenges because it requires a huge mindset shift on the part of the parents that to realize that scores aren't the sole defining indicators of their children's success. They have to accept the fact that schools aren't going to assess their kids as much anymore. And this doesn't sit well with some parents because they are afraid that their children aren't able to benchmark whether their kids are doing as well as other kids. So these are some of the challenges that I see for the system, because for the teachers themselves, you've been so used to teaching and then testing the kids at regular intervals to see whether they are performing well. But now with the exams removed, teachers are like trying to, so then how therefore do I assess, can I trust my own assessment? And then there's also a bit of unease because in the past, your success as a school was also measured by how well the school did at national exams. So without that, right, schools are also asking themselves, so how do we know that we're still a good school? How do we know that we are a top school? And teachers are also concerned that if I don't produce students with good, excellent scores, will I be ranked or appraised unfavorably? So there's a lot of that kind of tension that is going on now within the society and within schools itself, among the teachers, the parents, and even the students themselves. And teachers are also struggling in the fact that, okay, so now because we don't want to overemphasize academic success, we got to differentiate more. What does that mean for my craft as an educator? Is it more demanding now because I've got to cater for a more diverse range of students? We don't put kids into a top class. We don't stream them by ability. We just like balance out every class, and there's a bunch of good ones and the kids who are not so academically gifted in each class. So how do I deal with all these changes? So these are some of the changes and challenges that we have in the system. Yeah. So with that brings us to my final slide, which is basically that we are preparing for a future we do not know. I think Singapore is very aware that the world is changing. The digital age is bringing in new challenges that we are not sure entirely where you will land us. So we're trying to prepare our kids for a world that we ourselves are not sure. There are probably jobs that they're going to be taking that probably don't exist today. So it's all that uncertainty that we're trying to prepare for as a system. And this sometimes makes it challenging for us and for our leaders on how to best proceed. Because everything is just a bet. You don't have a sure win in this case. So with that, I thank you. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I'm just open for questions if you have any.
Well, Jeremy, I'll jump in again as the first one, and we'll see if there are others. But I loved everything you were talking about, the values-driven education. I think that's one of the things that I have admired the Singapore education system the most, is that you're having very relevant conversations. You look to where you might have your weaknesses and where your strengths are, and you start having those conversations. So my question is, again, change is hard. And I'm wondering if the values-driven education is harder on the teachers or the parents or the students or the admin. Like, who's struggling the most with the mind shift? And how do you deal with that?
I think that it falls heavily on the teachers, and then secondly the parents, because parents have to accept now that okay, the schools aren't really looking at exam scores very much now. There are changing modes of assessment. The school is talking more about values. Sometimes parents find it's like, I know I don't really want to hear that. Just tell me how well my kid did on the test, because I'm more concerned about whether he's going to get into a good varsity and whether he's going to get a good job after that. So parents find that a bit difficult to accept. For the teachers' part, the teachers would now have to think about, when I position my lessons, it's not just about the content. I need to talk a bit about values. I need to really like anchor the kids in solid values. And one of the challenges for teachers is, do I have to assess this? And if I have to assess this, how do I assess values education? I can deliver a lesson on values, but at the end of it, am I expected to evaluate this? And if I am, how do I do it? And is that kind of evaluation valid? I mean, someone can just give me a expected answer, but does that mean that value education has made an impact? It's been effective. So these are some of the questions that teachers ask. Yeah, and because it's a lot more, uh, you know, it's more of a shifting goal rather than scores, which are very quantitative. It's very easy to see whether you've hit what you want to do. But for values education, it's sort of like ambiguous. So that's some of the challenge for teachers. But I think the parents also on their end, some of them stubbornly refuse to move from that point. It's like, don't bother to tell me that, just tell me what's my kid's score. So that's why it sort of like feeds that whole tuition and shadow economy that we have, where you have all the tuition centers outside, because these help give the parents confidence that their kids have the extra boost to do well in the exam. Yeah.